want to thank you all for joining us today. This is a very exciting conversation. Obviously we've been looking forward to this a while. We've been planning it for a couple of months now, and the subject never gets old. So as long as it took, this was going to happen. This conversation was going to happen because climate migration is just getting started. So I just want to introduce everybody. With us today is Elizabeth Rush, author of Rising, Dispatches from the New American Shore. She's also a writer, photographer, and environmental writing professor at Brown University. So thank you for joining us, Elizabeth.
Thank you for having me, Alex.
And also with us is Carrie Hewlett. Carrie is director of the Climate Migration Program at the Consensus Building Institute. Thank you, Carrie, for joining us as well.
Sure. Happy to be here. Thanks.
And Miriam, now I will need a little help on the pronunciation of your last name, Miriam, is Chazal Noel.
Chazal Noel, yes.
Chazal Noel, that sounds French, right?
It is French, yes.
Okay, and the second last name is?
Traoré, which is from Mali.
From Mali?
Yes.
Well, there you go. And Miriam is the Environment and Climate Change Migration Specialist at the International Organization for Migration of the United Nations. So thank you, Miriam, for joining us today.
Thank you.
I just want to start by just briefly setting the table here. It's before we hit record, we were talking about Puerto Rico, and I'm in Puerto Rico, and after Maria, we had 300,000 people leaving the island. So climate migration for us is a very palpable, real thing, and the Atlantic season is firing up right now, so we're all not looking forward to, but we all kind of expect, to be hit again, as is the rest of the world being hit again and again by these climate impacts and events. And one of the most really vexing, difficult issues to deal with as a result of that is migration, both internally in a country as well as internationally across borders. And we want to talk, about both angles and both aspects. And I wanted to start with you, Miriam, at the, I guess, more of a global perspective, a big picture idea in terms of how you see it and how the IOM is looking at this. I just want to read a quote from a UN senior expert who's quoted recently in the media as saying that every country will be affected by people on the move in relation to climate change, whether they are origin, transit, or destination countries. And so it kind of puts this in perspective. We have origin, transit, destination countries, and it's every country, pretty much, as we look forward to worsening climate change and the spiral of really exponential climate impacts that are going to happen and get worse. It is true. I mean, no country will be spared, either from internal or international migration. So what is on your plate at the IOM in dealing with this pretty massive issue that's just getting started again?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's very clear that this is indeed a massive issue and the current reality, because up until a certain point, most people thought that climate change and migration that belonged to the future. We're talking about, mass movements happening in the future. But now we realize that this is happening right now in all parts of the world, from Europe to the small island states in the Pacific to Africa, Asia. Everyone is concerned. So from a global perspective, we're talking here about bringing attention at the global policy level. A few years ago, no one was talking about climate change and migration. It was really a marginal topic. If you were going to the big climate change conference, for instance, no one was discussing this. But things have changed. The Paris Agreement, the Climate Paris Agreement 3 years ago, changed a lot of things because it created institutional structure within the climate change negotiations to discuss migration issues. And then more and more countries started to be interested in the topic. And right now at the United Nations, there was the negotiations for a global pact on international migration concluded a few weeks ago. And this is called the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. So this is the main global instrument for states to address migration issues. So in this compact, there was a lot of references to climate change. So all that to say that there is a global consciousness that climate change and migrations are issues to be discussed, politically speaking. And of course, the political level need to translate into operational dimensions. So we're also looking at developing programs, projects in many parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, it's one of the most exciting things going on in migration right now, this compact for migration. Very promising, very exciting. And as you say, climate is one aspect of it. I mean, migration covers, there's so many reasons why people migrate. And so the compact for migration covers all of them. But climate will certainly feature, if not today, the next 10, 20 years, as probably the chief driver of migration around the world. And so to have a compact kind of set up now, you know, this many years before the problem spirals is important. So absolutely. Now, you also have an initiative at the IOM called Department for Emergency Migration, which is more disaster focused, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that and what's going on? What's the latest? What do you see happening moving forward?
So absolutely. So we have many people working on the humanitarian emergencies. So what we are seeing here is that we have more and more emergencies linked to natural disasters. So these natural disasters very often are linked to the worsening effects of climate change. Not always, but very often. So what we are seeing is more and more people displaced within their own countries, mostly, but sometimes also across border, due to drought, floods, earthquakes, basically natural events. And for instance, this morning, I just opened a report. I see that in a country that not many people know about, Burundi, you have 70,000 people who are currently displaced because of natural disasters. And this is a lot of people, but very few people are aware of it. So you have a lot of emergencies linked to natural disasters all throughout the world. So what do you do when you're faced with this emergency? So at IOM, we are managing camps for internally displaced persons so that we can have a safe place if they are displaced. I mean, there's also a whole sorts of other kind of direct assistance to these people. So yeah, there's a lot of humanitarian efforts to be made for people displaced by natural disasters.
Yeah, and you asked a good question, right? I mean, what to do, and Carrie here from the Climate Migration Initiative has some answers. So I know at the domestic level, specifically focused on the U.S. Carrie, if you can brief us briefly in terms of the initiatives that you're working on right now, some of the case studies that you've seen, and some of the issues that you face at the micro global level when you work with a community and to get them focused on this issue.
Sure. I mean, we do not have any answers, to be very clear. I think we are trying to help a lot of communities undertake a lot of experiments because we think it's really hard to know how to do this. We are, at the moment, the Climate Migration Network is working to help 5 small projects in different places around, in this case, just around the US, with different elements of this problem. So, for example, one of the groups that we have funded to get started on a project that will be a bigger project and they want to do long term is in Alaska, working with native groups in Alaska that are really trying to figure out how do we replicate what one community learns in one place about relocation and then share that information with other communities in the same area in the same specific circumstances. So one problem, and therefore sort of some set of solutions has to address this, is how do you communicate what you learn if you and your neighbors, or you and your town, you and your community do actually figure out how to relocate together to another place? How do you share that information with someone else in a way that they could then try to learn from your model? So that's an example of one experiment, I guess, is how I feel more comfortable saying it than solution,
Right.
but really trying to figure out how to document, think about the steps, who gets involved, what sorts of rules and regulations do you have to pay attention to, where are the sources of funding for this kind of thing, how do you deal with conflict within the community around what you do, where you go, and how you get there. All of those kinds of things in one little place can be shared to another little place that hopefully can work with it. And just as another example, there's another community that is working in Louisiana on how to help both receiving and migrating communities talk to one another about what they need in this process of migration. So those are just a couple of the experiments that we're working with. But we essentially try to help these communities that are dealing with this on a micro scale, a neighborhood, or maybe a little bit bigger than that, several neighborhoods scale, try to figure out for themselves what do they need to do in order to move out of harm's way.
I was going to say one thing that I've realized in writing this book about different coastal communities, specifically in the United States, that are trying to come to terms with rising seas and often relocate away from risk, is that at a base level, a lot of places don't know that in the US we have funding apparatuses available to help accelerate, especially after a disaster, relocation or managed retreat. So I think part of it, and I would assume, though I don't entirely know, that of course this is going to be different depending on which country you're located in. So in the US, we have the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program that helps relocate low-lying communities that are flood prone out of the flood zone. And a lot of places that I spent time in over the past 5 years, while I've been researching communities hard hit by coastal flooding as the climate warms, is that some places folks don't know that even exists. So I think there's part of our job is to also just start to have a larger, broader public conversation around what resources are available and also then how people are using them. I should say that I got started writing Rising when 8 years ago I was in Bangladesh and I was reporting on the India-Bangladesh border fence. And I encountered tons of farmers in Bangladesh who said the fence isn't so much a problem, it's the fact that we have saline inundation that's ruining our crops and forcing us to relocate. And if we have to relocate, we're trying to navigate through that fence. We're trying to, ultimately become refugees in India. But the real problem is that sort of initial physical threat to lives and livelihoods that comes with rising seas. And, I think especially in the US, we have a danger of thinking about these things as like, oh, they're problems for elsewhere, but we don't have these problems. And in fact, it's really a global problem.
So, and one of the things that is highlighted in the climate migration site that had kind of caught my eye was the policy and leadership challenges of really getting policymakers and getting leaders of various kinds and various levels engaged and really leading on this and putting together, stepping up and doing what needs to be done to bring their people on board. So how are you kind of approaching that from the IOM perspective? Just making sure that we have engaged, educated, capable leaders leading.
Absolutely. So that ties exactly with what Carrie and Elizabeth were saying about documenting even at the community level. So basically, we call this best practice. If we can bring this kind of proof to the leaders, policymakers, people who have an influence at their national, regional, or global level to do something about the topic, if you can bring to these people evidence, like from these communities, what is it that worked, that didn't work? Of course, some things are context-specific, but many of the results, I'm sure, are applicable to many communities worldwide. So that's one thing. Bring proof, bring concrete evidence of how you can deal with these challenges, because then it becomes less scary if you see that in other parts of the world it has worked. And then, of course, it's a question of building the capacities of the different government officials who have a stake in that question. So it can be anything from the ministries dealing with migration people to dealing with migration in general, to the ministries dealing with environmental or climate factors. So you have to bring these people together. There are a lot of programs linked to capacity building. At IOM, we have one as well. So that's where you try to translate. That's also why you bring these examples from the community level that you were talking about, and discuss, what can be done concretely. How do you respond? How do you respond? What kind of policies do you need to develop for this to work beyond the community level, but also at the scale of the whole country, for instance?
Yeah, so I guess it would help to, as you say, build this pool, this bank of data and case studies and experiences from around the world, so that leaders in places that are just starting to think about it can then go someplace where they have this pool of information to draw on and find answers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think also in the case of these communities, for instance, to me, it's important to identify a couple of people within those communities who can come and speak to other people beyond their countries and their region. They can go to other places and speak to the policymakers, speak to the planners and practitioners, and tell them in their own words what happened when they did a relocation, for instance. I think that would be extremely powerful.
That I think we are only now beginning to wrap our minds around the fact that it is impacting folks in Bangladesh just as it's impacting folks in Louisiana, just as it's impacting folks in Alaska. And so absolutely coming up with these case studies and having testimonies from folks that are in the position of the refugee, of the person relocating, I think is key to helping raise our broader consciousness that we're all in this together. And while we have different funding streams or lack of funding streams often that are dependent upon sort of pre-existing structural inequalities, the more that we can start to do information sharing amongst and between people on the front lines of this problem, the better off we're going to be in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Carrie, can you walk us through, for example, when you approach a community, a community at risk, and so it would be really interesting to learn how it actually happens.
Well, I guess I'll say that the thing that is remarkable about this topic is that in any given community, you will find the full range of opinions about whether or not to migrate, when to migrate, if you migrate, how to pay for it, who's responsible for that. And then you'll have a whole different set of leadership questions around whether or not people have the sort of interest and willingness to take action. So I'll kind of compare two examples. These are a little bit sensitive, so I hope you don't mind. I'm not actually going to name the towns, but I'm going to compare two towns. So one town was hit during Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, so hard that the people who lived there had been flooded many times previously, but had always rebuilt, finally said, this is it. But a lot of people felt that way, but it really took one person from within the community who said, I am going to rally and organize my neighbors, and we are going to move. And it took the leadership of that one person to get all of the neighbors to buy in. And that was just one of about 1,000 steps. After that, you had to find the money, had to get the support of the political leadership, had to find a place to go, had to figure out how to equitably distribute those funds. I mean, there's a lot of work to do. But without the leadership of that one person who was known and trusted in the community and could talk to the neighbors and persuade them that it was time, it never would have happened, because there's nothing special about the impact, the actual physical impact to that community. There was nothing special about it relative to hundreds of other places, even in that same storm, let alone other storms. So in that case, I think the thing that made the big difference was the leadership of an individual who's trusted. Well, let me compare that to another community that has been hit over and over and over again, has already lost, and these two communities are both in the northeast of the United States. They're relatively similar in that way. It's been hit over and over and over again. People have moved haphazardly, one house here, one community there. Sorry, not community, but just sort of household by household. But there's a lot of the community itself, and by the community, I mean the local government, the local town government, has huge incentive not to talk about migration, not to talk about people moving, because a loss of, we often think about, a house or a place where someone lives, that if that, say, is taken by the sea, that's a loss to the individual homeowner or resident there. That is absolutely true, and I think that's the greatest impact. But if you multiply that over an entire community, that's an enormous loss of tax base for that community. So one of the big problems we have is that local communities either can't or won't think long-term enough to be proactive about migration that is going to happen, about the loss of some of the land that is part of their community. And thinking about that proactively is very scary, because as you lose land, quote unquote, you lose tax base. And as you lose tax base, your community becomes potentially not viable anymore. And so there's real incentive, and I don't mean this in any sort of, it's not nefarious in any way, but there is real incentive for local leadership not to approach and talk about this topic, no matter where you are, because you do depend on the property basically that is along the coast or along the river that is threatened. So again, in that case, what are the big factors? The big factors are lack of leadership in this case, but beyond that, let's say there's even leadership, where are they going to go for the money? The reality is that all the money, at least in the United States and true of other places that I've seen at least, all the money is in recovery. All the money and all the institutional support, all the information is in recovery. There is so little money, so little institutional support, and so little information that is dedicated to thinking ahead and thinking proactively and being prepared. So that's just a couple examples, but you're really struggling with all these dynamics in each little place. And the interplay of those dynamics is what makes it possible or not possible for people to even talk about it, let alone actually do it.
I think I want to weigh in just a little bit on the Staten Island case, because there's, in my mind, a couple interesting things in addition to what you mentioned, Carrie, that are at play there. One is that I think, yes, local leadership played a huge role in their ability to actually retreat. But I think you also have to think of that community in a historical context, right? It's a working class, low-lying community that does get hit again and again and again, and is often at the bottom of the municipal repair list. So there is a local leader who comes in and is able to harness, I think, a pre-existing set of aggravations around not having access to fair, just access to recovery funding. And the other thing that you have to think about there is the fact that folks, as they started to sign on to be part of this managed retreat program, said, I will sell my home to the state and I will let it go back to nature. I will have it bulldozed, but I want that land to remain open space in perpetuity. I want the land to act as a kind of buffer in the storms to come and help protect inland residents. And as I researched retreat, I find those two things really deeply compelling parts of this equation. How do you get people interested in retreat? I think there's often an underlying sense of justice at play that will often get a community to sign on to being part of a managed retreat program. The other interesting thing that happened in Staten Island after Sandy was that the city, fearful of losing that tax base, said, we will give you a 5% bonus on closing if you relocate within the 5 boroughs. Informal information from folks in Staten Island that I've stayed in touch with that are part of the retreat leads me to believe that roughly 75 to 80% of people relocated within 5 miles of their home. So I think we also have this idea that relocation means the absolute fracturing of a community, And that's not always the case, especially in locations that have a kind of topographical diversity, that you could move away from flood risk and still be, you know, a stone's throw from the place where you go grocery shopping and your butcher and your, you know, telephone repair service. So I think Staten Island is, for me, a really interesting case study in both sort of the history of what can lead a community to want to retreat, and also at least gives us insight into how to start to address that question around how do we retreat but maybe not lose tax base? How do we get local politicians interested in this word that at the outset sounds really damaging potentially to their community and the way that their different municipal services are financed?
Fascinating discussion, because I mean, if one thing is just jumping out here is the diversity, right? The multiplicity of cases and experiences and possibilities. And now, Miriam, if you can address that from a global perspective, I mean, we have the Maldives negotiating with Australia to buy land across the ocean to move. I mean, we have a case like Puerto Rico that, you know, when you combine the coming storms with the coming droughts, with the coming heat waves, with the coming sea level rise, there is a real possibility that we may have to evacuate the entire population of Puerto Rico in the next 20 to 30 years, if not, you know, shortly after that. And so we have these really diverse situations when you have a large continental country like the US, where you have a lot of cities to move to, or as Elizabeth just said, maybe down the street perhaps might work. In other places around the world, you know, it's a bit more difficult. And so, you know, how, you know, what do you think, you know, needs to happen, Miriam, to kind of get that message across and kind of awaken more interest by more people in far more diverse places, you know, based on their level of risk?
So what I find interesting is that the challenges that Carrie and Elizabeth highlighted at the community level, you see exactly the same at the global level, which is the lack of investment in planning and preparation. There is very little thinking about that. So I think the key to answer to respond to all of these challenges is to really look into planning on the basis of the good practices, for instance, from the US or any other countries, and try to think in advance and not, you know, react. But that's complicated because it's really hard for policymakers and donors to think, okay, let's think in advance, let's try to be proactive before the fact rather than after. So yeah, that's a big challenge.
Yeah, you know, in terms of the mentality, and I'd like to end with this, and if we can just go around the room here and have each of you kind of address more of the emotional, mental challenge. This is draining for a lot of people. We're seeing it here. Again, 300,000 people moved out after Maria. We fully anticipate a lot more waves of migration happening. In the case of Puerto Rico, it's easy because we can just get on the plane and go to the States. In the case of other countries that they don't have those relationships, those visa arrangements, it's a lot more difficult. And so there's attachment to community, there's attachment to place. There's this just leaving, getting up and leaving. There's also the equity challenge. It depends how much money you have as a family, as a person. Because we're talking about funding decisions here when there's public policy and funding needs for community level, but at a family level, there's what's something called the equity trap, right? When people are trapped in their communities and they cannot leave or relocate because they just don't have the money, they just don't have the resources, and that imposes an additional emotional strain on people. So, and Elizabeth, you know, I wrote down on the lead up to your book and on your website, you describe the book as a meditation of vulnerability, or a meditation of or by the vulnerable, or about the vulnerable. So tell us a little bit more about that, and then if we can get Miriam and Carrie to address that emotional kind of mental challenge as well.
So I should say that my book focuses only on communities in the United States. And additionally, it only focuses on wetland communities, so communities that are sited alongside of or on top of former wetlands. And one thing that I found, which was surprising to me, was that these are some of the most vulnerable people married to the most vulnerable land. So how did you end up with a neighborhood like the Tan Yard in Pensacola, which is actually underwater because of the tropical storm that's going through the Gulf right now? How did those folks end up there? Many of them are ancestors of runaway slaves, and they sought out, their ancestors sought out the Tan Yard, the land that was the Tan Yard, because it was a kind of swamp. It was land that wasn't desired. It was land that could also act as a kind of invisibility cloak. It was a kind of ecosystem that's easy to defend and hard to attack. And so that's something that I found all over this country, is that the places that are most vulnerable now also have these longer compounded histories of vulnerabilities. And one thing that I found somewhat hopeful as I started to research this book and write about it was that these populations are starting to find a kind of commonality, and they're working on coalition building based on their shared vulnerabilities, and starting to raise questions around environmental justice and social justice, and how we talk about managed retreat in a way that actually really highlights and helps folks that are stuck in that equity trap move away from risk. Because you're right, if your second home is on the beach and you lose it during a storm, that's not such a big deal. But what if you have a mortgage, flood insurance is on the rise, you can't afford to pay the new premiums, and if you look at selling your house, you can't get enough money to get yourself out of debt. So you're sort of stuck in place. So one thing that I found hopeful is that, for instance, there's a group called Flood Forum USA that actually started during last year's really disastrous hurricane season. And it's a coalition of flood survivors around the country that do information sharing around both raising political awareness and also getting access to resources for recovery, as well as preventative resources to help shield the community from flooding in the short term, and then maybe help residents relocate in the long term. And in the year since they founded, they are already 30,000 members strong. And one of the neat things that group can do is it'll link a community with a pro bono hydrologist who will then come in, do an assessment of the community, and help them create the language they need to present to local politicians around what kind of resources will help them weather the storms to come. And so I definitely recommend looking into that group of flood survivors called Flood Forum USA. And again, it's thinking sort of collectively about vulnerability, trying to think beyond the individual and think of vulnerability not just as something that might expose one to risk, but something that can also be used collectively to get the resources you need to move away from that risk.
Fantastic resource. Thank you for that. So Carrie, from your perspective also, again, the emotional, Elizabeth just pointed to one solution, which is to look for connections, look for organizations, look for really becoming involved in whether it's your immediate community or a group of people beyond your community that is engaged. Maybe that helps ease people into this coming reality that they might at some point have to move. So how, what kind of ways would you suggest people, kind of deal better with the emotional weight of this?
I guess I have two thoughts on that. One is that, I have three thoughts, I guess. The first is that I think acknowledging that it is an emotional problem is a huge first step, because often the conversations that happen around managed retreat are very technical conversations. It comes down to this almost engineering question of how much risk is there? What is the cost? A lot of cost benefit analysis. And then it's as if these human beings are just going to pick up and go somewhere else because that makes sense and it's rational. I think the first is to recognize that there is a lot of non-rational thinking going on from everyone, not just the people who live there, but people who don't live there, from the politicians, from the decision makers, from those who decide where to spend the money, all of that. So and all of these decisions are actually very emotional, and they are really guided by how people feel, and that's how they feel about the place that they are tied to, how they feel about other people, and whether or not they deserve to be there or don't deserve to be there. There's a lot of emotion in this. So I think, first of all, just acknowledging that it's an extremely emotional issue, and we need to bring people to the table, the solution table, which is what we're trying to do at the Climate Migration Network. We need to bring people to that table who think about this problem from different perspectives. They don't think about it like an engineer or a planner. They think about it like an artist or a trauma specialist. You know, they think about it differently. So I think that's one piece. A second piece is something that Elizabeth already mentioned, which is what goes in the place when people move away from a vulnerable place. What remains? What gets honored in that place? What gets remembered? As Elizabeth mentioned, people will give up a family home that they've had for decades if they are confident that it will be returned to nature. But as they think that some developer is going to come in and buy that plot of land and build something nice that rich people can move into, they won't sell it. They'd rather die in it. So there's something about what happens to this place that I've loved next. And if it becomes a place that sort of feels more natural, or a place that provides protection to someone else, then that can help people get over the emotion of it. And so I guess the third piece is actually very related to that, which is to change the thinking from loss to thinking of legacy. How do we build legacy? How do we think about these places that at one time were habitable and are not going to be forever? And so if they're not habitable forever, then what are they? How do we remember them? How do we honor them? How do we honor the people and the habitats, the animals, everything, and the sort of ecosystem services that these places can provide in the future? So there's a real opportunity, I think, in adjusting mindset, particularly if we can correct some of those equity, if we can correct some of the problems that have been caused and made people less equitable in the past. If in the transition from these vulnerable places to less vulnerable places, we can actually try to correct and steer out of those horrible inequities that we've created in the past through planning, then that can be one good outcome of this. And I think that can help people emotionally connect to the transition in a positive way more than in terms of loss.
Thank you for that. And you just gave, I think, Elizabeth and perhaps myself, a kind of lead into writing about this legacy subject. I never thought of that one. That's really, awesome. And from a writer's perspective, to approach the problem, as legacy is terrific. So there you go, Elizabeth. And I look forward to reading your story on that. Miriam, if you can please kind of like close out the conversation. I mean, we can be here hours talking about this, but we can't. And so on, again, this kind of same issue on the whole emotional baggage, but from a multicultural perspective, this is really diverse. If you look at Africa and Europe and Latin America and North America, any thoughts in terms of how people deal with this differently based on culture and location from a multi-cultural multi-country perspective?
No, I mean, absolutely. That's another fascinating dimensions of the problem is worldwide, but yet we see commonalities in reactions to this fear of losing the cultural heritage, places, traditional livelihood, and so on. I mean, whether you go to an African village in the desert, or if you go to South America in communities affected by water scarcity, they all say the same thing, like, and what about our cemeteries? What about our churches? What about the physical, very concrete, dimensions of our cultural heritage? What do we do with that? They're not necessarily against relocating, but I remember speaking to national policymakers in Colombia And she was telling me that the relocation failed after everything seemed to be going quite well, because no one could agree on where the new church would be in the new communities. So yes, it's a problem specific to, I mean, each culture has its problem, but we see that at the global level, there is a very strong sense of loss, psychological, lack of well-being, at the idea of leaving behind all of this, the physical as well as the emotional life. So what can you do about that? I think Carrie had very good suggestions, and I think those can also be replicated in the discussions at the global level. First of all, you need to be okay to speak about it, because at the moment, in the global climate negotiations, for instance, there's a whole discussion around what are non-economic losses. So exactly these things. How do you compensate or not compensate people? But this is a very political discussion, so it's hard to have that discussion. But once we start having that discussion, but it can maybe also bring some peace to the countries who feel that they bear a disproportionate burden compared to their, in relation to the fact that they didn't really contribute to climate impacts. So more discussions, but also systematically think of this question, not just think of this is a climate change issues. No, it's also about people. What do we do with these people? It's stories, it's individuals, and not just think technically. So, and that's also something that sometimes is missing in these conversations at the global level. You don't really see the individuality of each story. So that's also something that I think that needs to be brought.
Absolutely. Wow. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you all, Miriam, Elizabeth, Carrie, for taking the time to share your thoughts, your insights. Priceless experience, priceless information. And we look forward to future conversations as well. So we'll be certainly keeping track of all of you and what you do from now on. Very important work. So thank you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. Thanks to Carrie and Elizabeth. I cannot say how much your inputs are important to people like me who work at the global level.
Thank you. And let's all stay in touch. I'm interested to see what you all are up to.
Absolutely.
Same. Thank you, Alex, for connecting us.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Thank you, and bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye now. Take care.